Welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, the show that remembers the good and sometimes the not so good old days of parenting past. I'm your host, Samantha Kemp Jackson from the Multiple Mayhem Mama blog, and every week we'll be talking about how things were then and how they are now, parenting through the lens of the ages, if you will. Now, whether you're a parent, a kid, or someone who used to be a kid, you'll want to stay tuned as we reminisce about the past, embrace the future, and marvel in the present how things have changed. If you're ready to glance back in time at kids, parenting, and the good old days, you're in the right place. So sit back, relax, and let's take a trip down parenting's memory lane. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Everybody needs a hack, a parenting hack, a mom hack, or if you're a dad, a life hack. In this episode of the PTN podcast, I talk to the creators of the new podcast, Life Hacks for Single Dads. Here's our discussion. So welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast. Doug and Joe, thank you for being here.
Oh, nice to be here. Very nice to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, it's so great to have you. So I am so intrigued by what you guys are embarking upon, Life Hacks for Single Dads. I think it is a really interesting concept. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that in terms of how you got to this point where you want to have this podcast about parenting from the perspective of a single dad and what you plan to talk to your audience about. Maybe give us a little bit of a background on both of your family structures and, your kids and what you're going to teach us.
Okay.
Joe.
Oh, well, we came up with the idea for Life Hacks for Single Dads because we thought that the life of a single parent is hard enough. And then dads seem to, and men often generally, don't seem to want to take advice very often, don't want to read parenting magazines, don't want to do all the things that are sort of a normal parent does, or single dads anyway. So we thought a good, concise, quick podcast that they could listen to on the way to work, in the shower, at the gym, or whatever would be an excellent way to dispense parenting advice.
Yep. And the way this all came together was I have known Joe for a long time. We used to work together at the same university, and we got to be friends that way. And we didn't know each other super well. I knew he, had a son, and I had my own kids. I was pretty sure I had kids too. And so we just started hanging out a little bit, and I eventually moved to the DC area. And my two sons are from two different relationships in my own life. And so I would be coming back to Pittsburgh on a regular basis to see my older son and sometimes staying with Joe. And in doing so, we spent a lot of time together as, he and I as friends, and then our sons became friends. And we both realized that we actually had a lot in common because our sons are the same age and we were both dealing with a lot of the same issues that single dads generally deal with, at least it seemed to us. And so we started talking a little bit more about it. And this light bulb went off in our heads that, as much as we are struggling as single dads, we're also learning an awful lot about families, about our kids, about ourselves, about life in general. And so we decided that it might actually be interesting and beneficial for us to, pursue this idea and then even turn it into something where we're trying to dialogue with a broader audience about some of these common issues.
That's great. I mean, I think that you're onto something because what you had said previously about, women and men, I think. You were talking about the gender differences in terms of how we process information and how we hear information. I think that's largely true. I think women, generally speaking, tend to be perhaps a little bit more verbose, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. And I think oftentimes men just want to kind of get to the details, like, tell me what I need to know. And I think it's really quite interesting that you guys have had a professional relationship and which has evolved into a personal relationship with both yourselves as friends and also with your children. So give me an example of some of the things you might be talking about in terms of life hacks for single dads. And remember that this particular particular podcast, I talk a lot about parenting through the lens of the ages, so how things used to be and how things are now. So how are things in terms of parenting your kids as fathers different from how perhaps you were raised as a child? And what are some of the hacks that you have to provide to the audience?
Well, we think that for a lot of us, especially those of us of our age, so to speak, divorce wasn't all that common when we were young, or certainly wasn't as common as it is now. And being a single dad, being a single parent was really rare. And so we didn't learn growing up through osmosis what parenting without a partner would be like. And so, for instance, this is Joe speaking, I find that, I don't have that 5 minutes, oh, honey, will you watch the kids for 5 minutes while I go lie down and calm down. My son pissed me off about something. You don't have that ability to just take a couple of minutes. You're on stage all the time. And so that's what we think is one of the major things that people don't realize. It's that extra little 5-minute burst of time of relaxation or whatever you do that helps you get through the day, which then makes the next day better and the whole week better and the whole month better.
And I would add too, it's probably worth noting that Joe and I have different custody situations. Joe has his son 50-50 with his ex. And for me, I see my kids on the weekends essentially. So, and sometimes it's, I see one of my sons one weekend and then my other son the following weekend. And then back to the, first son the following weekend. So, and I'm also traveling between states to make all that happen. I try to get my kids together as much as possible. It's usually about once a month plus extended time in the summer and then on the holidays. But the point that I really want to make is what I have kind of come to realize in terms of the generational difference between my relationship with my dad growing up and the relationships that I strive to have with my own sons is the kind of the closeness, the open and honest dialogue. I would like to think that my kids feel comfortable talking to me about just about anything. And even if they don't physically see me as much, I try to kind of compensate for that or close that gap by really focusing intensively on the quality of the relationship. Whereas when I was growing up, I had a really good dad, and I love my dad and I respect my dad, but he was kind of one of those old school guys who put in an honest day's work and then, came home and just needed to decompress. And there wasn't as much of the kind of hands-on interaction that I strive to maintain with my relationships with my kids.
An example of that is one of our shows is about collecting. And that's one of the hacks we talk about in that show. And what we say, among the other things we say in that show is, partly because of TV, but also other reasons, kids don't collect like they used to. But learning to collect things, stake quarters, baseball cards, whatever it is very, very important, especially when they're young. And it's something you do together, and it is quite intensive because the two of you are concentrating on a small thing, a stamp, an arrowhead, whatever it happens to be, and you're actually very close in physical proximity. And you're talking about, Stan Musial's batting average was this, Andrew McCutcheon's batting average is that. You're going over whatever it is the thing that you're collecting is all about. And it just that communication and that closeness is absolutely essential. And, I collected all kinds of baseball cards, and my dad, we never talked about it because that was, that just wasn't done back then. But we think it's important now for that reason.
It is so important. I think that's a really interesting and salient point that you've both made in terms of the physical proximity to your children and the emotional proximity, because the two are not mutually exclusive, I think. And I think it's really interesting. Both of you have said that your relationship with your parents or your I guess your same-sex parent, your father, wasn't the same as the parenting that you're bestowing upon your kids right now.
No.
Do you think that that's because of technology, society? What do you think is the reason behind how parents raise their children now, specifically fathers? Because, let's face it, as you had mentioned, Doug, traditionally fathers were a little bit standoffish, were a little bit distant, not because they didn't love their children, but because, the norms of the time would dictate that, mothers are the nurturers and fathers are the ones who go out and make the money and take care of the family financially. And that has changed not only because we have single parents of who are both mothers and fathers, but also because there's a change in terms of, contribution to the family financially. What would you say about that, both of you?
Well, I would say that my dad seemed to have a different understanding of what was expected of him when he was my age and I was, my son's ages. And I think that it didn't really occur to him that there was a whole lot more that, he needed to do. He was a good provider. He was a responsible person, a good role model. And I always appreciated that about him. But I also sometimes felt like I wished he had been a little bit more, I guess, eager to or serious about pursuing an actual relationship with me. And it wasn't, I think I gradually came to feel like it maybe wasn't quite enough to have a strong and steady presence in the home. It was also, there was something else there that needed to be developed. And so, I think when I try to grapple with that thought, I think what I go back to is actually not my relationship with my dad, but my dad's relationship with his dad. And that was even kind of to a greater extent, this sort of traditional patriarchal, gender divide and very traditional mindsets in play. And I just think as a society as a whole, across not just 2, but maybe 3 or more generations, we're evolving to a place of more equality, more individual pursuit of, growth and meaning and truth. And that's all coming out in the way our one-on-one interactions transpire, whether that's between men and women or men and their children and moms and their children. So that's kind of what I would have to say about that. I think the feminist movement has a lot to do with it, and I think that's ultimately a good thing. But generally speaking, men just aren't in a position to do as they please. They're being challenged to, in a sense, contribute more, while on the other hand, maybe not being quite as solely responsible for contributing in ways that they used to be.
And I think of it as, the funny thing is when I look back, I think of my parents kind of as equally, and this is going to sound so awful, and I don't mean it, Mom and Dad. I don't mean it the way it sounds. Equally distant. I don't mean when I think about it, actually, maybe they did a little bit of the French thing that people talk about now. You raise them, but you let them go out. I think of my childhood as mostly with my brothers and friends, and except when we would go on trips and things like that, and then that sort of parenting really came into play when we were young and we're in the car for 15 hours going to Disney World. There's nothing else to do except talk. And so we did that. And one of the things we talk about on our show is making good use of car time, making good use of time when you're not distracted by a lot of other things. So I think you're right in the sense that a lot of it is technology, a lot of it is the outside world, but in some ways you can use that technology, use that outside world, or more importantly, the absence of it, when the absence of it rolls around, to strengthen the bond.
Very interesting. I agree with you. I'd have to say that there's definitely been a shift in terms of expectations from society, not just for mothers, but for fathers, and also expectations from children. So it's really interesting that you say about the equally distant parent, Joe.
Yeah.
Because my parents are still trying to grapple with their quote unquote distance with me and my brothers. I have 2 brothers. My parents are Caribbean background. And now my mother, and thankfully I still have my parents. They're in their 80s. But my mother actually often says to me, Sam, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never told you I loved you when you were growing up. And I see that, you tell your kids all the time, I love you, I love you, I love you. And I think at first my mother was taken a little bit aback because my kids would say to her, oh, I love you, Grandma. I love you. I love you. And she wouldn't know what to say, not because she didn't love them, but because she's just not used to that type of demonstrative, showcase of feelings.
Yeah.
So I think that, a lot of how we were raised is culturally based and also a sign of the times. But I think that we've come to a place where it's probably a good thing that we're a little bit more demonstrative with our kids, men and women, regardless of, what culture you're from. I think that we have gotten to a place where we're, trying to show our kids a little bit more how much they mean to us.
Yeah, I think if anything, we have to, ward ourselves off from the opposite extreme of being too indulgent. And maybe it's not possible to tell your kid that you love them too much or to mean that too much. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about more, figuring out what are appropriate boundaries in a society in which anything goes. Everyone's an individual, and people can pursue any inclinations or tastes that they so please, as long as it's within some realm of age appropriateness. And so I don't think the standards are quite as clear anymore. And I think people, these so-called traditional nuclear family units have largely been broken up and recreated in different ways. And so there's a sort of a sorting out process where on the one hand, there's a lot of good that's coming out of it, but we also have to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how to, hold on to the good that could potentially be lost.
And I think it's important to recognize and talk about and think about the fact that for most of us who are divorced parents, now a lot of single parents are single parents for other reasons, but for those of us who are divorced, we probably got divorced when our children were 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, and so they've lived a good part of their very formative years in theory, nuclear family. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's broken apart and it's very, very different. So I can't imagine what it must be like and must have been like to live that sort of life. But, my dad having another house and going to my dad's house, going to my mom's house. Oh, I do this. It just seems extremely foreign to me. So that's why I don't address it with my son as much as I should in appropriate ways. And I really have to remind myself, we have to talk about the fact that this is just as good a place as mom's house. Mom's just as good a place as our house. And, we have to be respectful of each of each other's traditions. And if I serve you chicken wings and mommy doesn't want you to ever have chicken wings, that's just, life. And I think that having that kind of self-reflection is, A, difficult, but B, very, very important. And that's the type of thing we like to bring up when we talk about on our show. We always have a hack about something, but usually the hack is kind of just a hook to get people interested in the show. The bigger issue is what we're really interested in getting at, and that's one of them, and there are many, many.
So having the dual households, that's a discussion point for you with your children. And
even an important one that Doug brings up is that using the pronouns is a good family strengthening pronoun is good. For instance, I always say, and I have to stop myself and force myself to say mom or mommy. My default position would say, "Oh, well, your mother will take care of that," or "You've got that at your mother's house." And your mother sounds. I didn't realize how overly formal and how Ward Cleaver that sounds.
It does. It does sound very formal. That's a really interesting point. I never really thought about that. But to say your mother, you're putting this kind of verbal distance between yourself and the person who is the other parent of your child.
Yeah.
Whereas when you say mom, it's a lot more comforting.
Right, exactly.
Right? For a child.
And you as the D4 say, you might be feeling that distance very strongly.
Yeah.
And so you're, like Joe said, your preference would be to say your mother. But you as a parent have to get past that, and you have to think about how all of this looks and feels to your kid. And even if you do live in different homes now, your kid is the same kid, and he's the one who has to go back and forth and make sense of everything. So if you say mom's house or mom said, that somehow I think helps the child to maybe heal and make sense of these different circumstances and not feel like there's so many wounds out there that are, ripping at everybody. Instead, it's just this process. It's a growth process, and it's not always going to be easy, but we will get through it because, the child is still going to be loved everywhere he goes or she goes. And as the father, you're certainly doing your part to create that different, but still very, very sincere reality.
Yeah. When you say your mother, it's like saying your teacher, your principal,
it's very
your
distant.
crossing guard. And I didn't realize that. I think I did say it. when I was married. Oh, wait till your mother comes home, that sort of thing. But it's wrong.
It's kind of a way of verbally distancing yourself from that other person. And that's very interesting that you say that, Joe, because, it's one thing if you're saying it if you are separated or divorced from your ex-spouse. It's another thing for so many parents who say, wait till your father gets home. There was even that TV show, right?
Yeah,
wait
sure.
till your father gets home, or wait till your mother gets home. So you're kind of disassociating yourself from the action that you're basically saying, you're going to get in trouble and I have nothing to do with it. Your mother or your father is going to deal with it.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting psychological point in terms of using that type of language. So that's great that you've sorted that out, because I had never thought about that. But now that I think about it, it makes such a difference, just a couple of words.
Yeah, well, you said it's good that Joe, it's good that you thought about that. Again, that's another one of Doug's big ideas. That's how things work here at the Life Hacks Laboratories. Doug comes in
Doug,
with
that was really good that you thought of that.
He comes in with the big ideas, and the rest of us in lab coats start working on them.
I was really just trying to figure out how to say less.
So now tell me, what is the format of the show going to be like? So tell me about how some of the life hacks are going to play out in terms of your podcast. How are you going to present them? Are you going to present them in the context of an issue like you just talked about? Or are you going to just come out of the gate with 1, 2, 3 points in terms of what people can take away in terms of parenting?
Well, we're experimenting with a couple of different approaches. For example, we just recently recorded a show on knowing your values, identifying your core values as a man, and how to figure out what those are, how to rank them, and then how to incorporate them into your parenting, and then instill values in your kid. And that was based on something that I came across. It was an idea that I came across in a book somewhere, and then I wrote out a couple of pages, just my own thinking on that. And as we were trying to base a podcast on that, it started to feel a little formal, a little stilted. And so we cut it off and just decided to just kind of glance at it and then freestyle off of it. And that ended up working. The script. And that ended up working out a lot better. We've had other experiences where we just went in blind and decided that we were going, whatever was going to happen, and we were going to completely freestyle from scratch. And that didn't work out so well either. So we're kind of finding our way. I think what's working best is if we talk for a few minutes before we start recording on, how we generally want to approach it, and then still leave a lot of room for spontaneity.
Some of the shows are more highbrow than other shows. The Value Show was quite highbrow, but also we had, the value is important to come to an understanding of your own values and then present them to your children. But how do you do that? Well, the hack we came up with is, you got to sit down old school and write it out for yourself, write it out by hand. That's a very good memory, something to impress upon your memory very strongly, and actually reflect upon it. And then maybe show it to another dad, someone you admire, someone you respect. And then some of the other shows are a lot more hacky in the sense that they're much more about the nuts and bolts of doing this one thing that's going to help your parenting. So we did another show on single tasking, which was, shut the phone off, put it in a drawer. When it's time to cook dinner, just cook dinner. When it's time to do the dishes, just do the dishes. Don't have anything else going on. Try to focus on the one aspect of your life that's right in front of you right now. And it turns out that the more we talked about it on the show, the more sort of life values came up in that discussion. So it depends, but they both have these two aspects to them. One is very much the hack, because that's the life hack for single dads, but the other is the sort of bigger issue that we're trying to address.
What I find as well quite interesting is the name of your podcast, Life Hacks for Single Dads. And the reason I find that interesting is that particular word, life hacks. I don't think I had ever heard of that terminology before, perhaps 10 years ago or sooner than that.
Yeah.
And I think that the term life hacks is indicative of the society in which we're living. We're looking for hacks, and we're looking for ways of making our lives a little bit less complicated and a little bit less hurried as it is right now. And I don't know if that's because of technology. I don't know if it's because we're just all really, really busy. But this whole concept of hacking in terms of life hacking, work hacking, whatever, is something that's relatively new. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would also say, to me, a hack, I agree with everything you just said, but when I think of a hack, I picture myself in a jungle with a machete trying to, like
Yeah.
literally hack a trail so that I kind of know where I'm going, making sense of the jungle that's out there. And so, yeah, I mean, we're busy, we're confused, we're stressed, we're trying to find our way. And it's not just about, conveniences. It's also about, having a sense of a path that you're creating for yourself as you go.
And I think that point specifically is very well expressed in our show on making personal thank you cards and not Valentine's Day cards, but maybe Valentine's Day cards, Christmas cards and birthday cards, making individual ones where you cut them out of the cardboard and you make it with the construction paper, whatever it is, and how that not only brings you physically close and emotionally close, but you can talk about grandma while you're making the card and, remember grandma and we did this and we did that. And that gives, we hope, gives not only your children the sense of the bigger picture that's out there that in life you're trying to hack your way through, but the other bigger picture of all the other people in their lives that you're trying to hack your way through. In other words, trying to have a good relationship with.
Yeah. And for me, as the recently divorced parent, I found that in doing this exercise with my kids, where we sat down and we made Christmas cards by hand and with the printing and the stamping and whatnot, and the kids got into it. They were younger then than they are now, but for me, it was a way of kind of reminding myself that in spite of my immediate circumstances, I still had a lot of really great people out there who I could count on and who I loved and who I know loved me too. So some of this is, kind of taking care of yourself a little bit as you go. And it's not strictly about teaching your kids, even though you can certainly kind of accomplish both goals at once.
So it sounds like this particular podcast and all of the things that you're going to be talking about in the podcast is cathartic for both of you in a certain way. Not only are you going to be conveying information to other parents out there, and I know that it's not just for single dads. I know that it's going to be for blended families, for step families, for single moms, for whomever. But do you find that in the process of going through what you're going to be talking about on the podcast, in terms of life hacks for single dads, it's a catharsis for you?
Yeah, it's a catharsis mainly because Doug brings the pizza and the beer to our famous
that helps.
recording studio.
Yeah, pizza and beer always help.
But yeah, it is. And I have to say that I go back to this one episode we did about single tasking, sometimes called solo testing. And when I don't do it all the time, but when I remind myself to do it, it really does make a huge difference. And it really does just bring a lot of peace into my house. Even though my son might be here with his friends running around tearing the place apart, in the kitchen where I am, I'm nice and calm because 50 other things aren't going on in my mind and aren't going. And a lot of things we do like that. We talk about how to handle car trips. We talk about how to handle the car. In fact, we're going to have a show on how to teach them how to drive and things like that. And a lot of that, again, the concentration really helps me calm down.
I think for me, because I don't physically have my kids as frequently as Joe does. I wish that I did, but I think for me, my main issue is more so trying to minimize the regret that comes from not seeing them as much as I would like to, and then trying to maximize the quality of the time that I do have with them. And so, by doing this project with Joe, it really kind of forces me to be as thoughtful as I should be about the time that I do have with my kids, and doing whatever I feasibly can to, like I said earlier, kind of compensate for the shortage of time and the distance that needs to be overcome in order for, my kids to grow up feeling like, my dad was certainly somebody who was present in our lives, and he was somebody who cared for us very much. Because I know that if I can kind of see into the future, and I know that if I come away from my son's childhood feeling like I failed in that regard, I know that's going to be very painful. So I try my best to use this project to my own advantage as I guess you could say as a catharsis, but also just as a way to remain cognizant of the importance of really investing in these primary relationships in my life.
And even though there are just two of us, I mean, I learn a lot from Doug's parenting when I see it in action, and also when we talk about it. When we say something on this, I'll say something on the show. He goes, and he'll say something. Oh, yes, I do that, but it's slightly different, and it really makes me think, and it might make me change the way I do things.
And
it helps an awful lot.
I could absolutely say the same thing about Joe. A lot of the ideas that he thinks that I've come up with that are so great, I actually got them from Joe, but I don't tell him. So.
Yeah, because that's the kind of relationship we have.
I watch Joe doing stuff, and then I articulate it, and he's like, "That's brilliant."
That's funny. Well, you know what? I think that, to your point, Doug, you had said that, you wish you could spend more time, but it's really about the quality of time that you spend with your children, not the quantity. And the fact that you've both taken the time and put together the time to have a podcast like this that talks about what you find works for being a parent to your children whom you love, and best practices for other parents. I think that speaks volumes in terms of what type of dads that you are to your kids. So I'm sure that your children will appreciate you when they grow up and they realize that their fathers took this time to really do the best thing for them through what they've learned in being parents. And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for being on the Parenting Then and Now podcast. And please tell us where we can find your podcast and when.
Well, we're launching the first week of March, and you can find us on everywhere you find your podcasts, all your podcast apps, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, everything. There isn't a parenting podcast network that I know of, but maybe we can start one. And by the way, we love your podcast.
Oh, thank you kindly. That's very nice of you to say. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Joe and Doug, for being on the Parenting Then and Now podcast. And we can't wait to listen to your new podcast yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was a fun conversation. It's always good to get another point of view, and who doesn't like life hacks? Check out the new podcast on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast provider.